was 34 the week I learned that my parents had priced our family at exactly two numbers: $11,000 and $412,000. One of those numbers was what they told me the house was worth. The other was what they never told me at all. Betrayal doesn't usually announce itself. It arrives disguised as a favor. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe, because this one has a title deed in it that changes everything. My name is Mara Voss. I am an estate planning attorney, which means I spend my working life reading the last, most honest sentences people ever write. A will is not a legal document to me. It is a person's final attempt to be understood after they no longer have a voice to explain themselves. I learned to read between the clauses before I learned to read between the lines of my own family, which tells you something about which skill came easier. I married young, to a quiet man named Theo who repaired pianos for a living and never once raised his voice at me in 11 years. He used to say that everything worth keeping in tune needed patience, not force. He died on a Tuesday in March, on the drive home from a house call. And after that I stopped believing that patience was owed to everyone equally. I kept it for the people who'd earned it. My family had not yet made that list, though I hadn't admitted that to myself. My family ran on an arithmetic I only understood in hindsight. My sister Rachel was 3 years younger, and had never held a job longer than 8 months. My parents called her sensitive. I was called capable, which in our house was another word for expendable to comfort. Capable people don't need comforting. Capable people show up. Capable people absorb the difference between what a family needs and what a family is willing to pay for. I paid my parents' property taxes for 4 years running, and nobody in that house ever once called it a loan. My grandmother, Eleanor Voss, was the only person in that family who ever treated my competence as something to be protected rather than harvested. She was sharp until the end, ran her own small real estate holdings, and used to tell me, over tea in her kitchen on Delancey Street, that a house is never just wood and pipe. A house is a decision someone made about who they trusted, she said once. I didn't understand what she meant until 18 months after she died. She passed in September, 4 months after Theo. I remember thinking, with the flat, funeral-numbed logic of that year, that grief was simply becoming my permanent weather. The reading of my grandmother's estate happened in November, in a conference room that smelled like printer toner and old coffee, at the office of her longtime attorney, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Ostro. My parents sat across from me. Rachel sat beside them, already scrolling apartment listings on her phone before Gerald had opened the folder. Here is where the story usually turns cruel quickly. Mine took its time, the way real cruelty does. Gerald read the will's primary bequests. The bulk of my grandmother's liquid assets, $610,000 in investment accounts, were split evenly between my mother and my mother's brother, my Uncle Philip. That part surprised no one. What came next was a single line about a property on Larchmont Avenue. The house I'd grown up visiting every Sunday, empty since my grandmother's decline into assisted living 3 years prior. Gerald read it plainly. The property at 214 Larchmont Avenue is to be held in trust for my granddaughter, Mara Elaine Voss, subject to the conditions outlined in Schedule C. My mother's face didn't change. That's the detail I kept coming back to later. She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone confirming an appointment she'd already put in her calendar. 3 weeks after that reading, my parents called a family dinner. My father made his usual show of carving the chicken himself, the same performance of provider he'd been running for 40 years. Partway through the meal, my mother set down her fork with the particular gentleness people use when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. "We've been thinking," she said, "about fairness. Rachel's been through so much this year, with the layoff and everything. And you're settled. You have your career. So we thought, since Larchmont is coming to you anyway, it only makes sense for us to help Rachel get into that new building on Ferrer Street, the one with the doorman." I asked how much the deposit was. My father said, not quite meeting my eyes, $11,000 for first and last, plus we're co-signing the lease. Then my mother added the sentence I would replay more than any other sentence in this story. You're getting a whole house, Mara. Rachel's getting an apartment. That's not even close to even, and we're fine with that, because you don't need us to be fair to you. You've never needed anyone. I did not raise my voice. I asked what condition the Larchmont house was in. My father said, with something close to relief at the change of subject. Honestly, it's a mess. Roof shot, there's water damage in the back bedroom, probably mold in the basement. Your grandmother let it go those last few years. We didn't want to bring it up before the reading, but between us, it might cost more to fix than it's worth. We figured you'd want to know what you were actually getting. What I was actually getting. I wrote that phrase down on a napkin under the table, the way I write down anything a client says that I suspect I'll need later. Old habit. The habit that pays my mortgage. I didn't know yet that it would end up paying for something else entirely. That night I drove past Larchmont Avenue instead of going straight home. I sat in my car outside the house for 11 minutes. I checked the dashboard clock, another old habit, looking at the dark windows and the overgrown hedge my grandmother used to trim every Saturday morning. I didn't go inside. I just sat with the one piece of information I already had. My parents had described this house to me in the past tense, like something already lost, before I'd even seen Schedule C. Schedule C was 22 pages long, and Gerald had mailed me a copy the week after the reading. I read it 3 times over 2 nights at my kitchen table, with a legal pad beside me the way I read every trust instrument I've ever handled for a client, slowly and assuming nothing. The house itself was, as my father said, in poor condition. What Schedule C actually transferred, though, was not simply the house. It was the house and the 2 adjoining lots my grandmother had quietly purchased in 1994 and 2001, both still recorded under her maiden name, Eleanor Marchetti, which was why my parents' cursory title search, if they'd even done one, would have shown only a single crumbling property and missed the 2 vacant parcels behind it entirely. Combined, the 3 parcels ran the full depth of the block, backing directly onto the planned route of the Larchmont Transit Corridor, a light rail extension the City Council had approved in a vote 8 months before my grandmother's death. I found the vote in a public records search that took me 40 minutes. My grandmother, it turned out, had been on the zoning notification list the entire time. The second revelation was smaller, and it was the one that actually took my breath for a moment. Folded into the back of Schedule C, in an envelope marked only Mara, was a letter in my grandmother's handwriting, dated the month after her diagnosis. It read in part, I am not leaving you a house to fix, Mara. I am leaving you the only thing in this family nobody can talk you out of. Your mother will call it charity. It isn't. It's math. You were always the one who could read a number and see the truth underneath it. Read this one all the way through before you let anyone tell you what it's worth. I did not act that weak. I read everything a 3rd time. I called the city planning office and confirmed the corridor route myself, using my own name, asking the questions a professional asks, not the questions a granddaughter asks. The 2 rear lots alone, per the most recent comparable sale on the block, were worth an estimated $401,000. Add the house, even discounted for repairs, and the total sat close to $412,000. My parents did not know this. What became clear over the following weeks was that they knew something, though just not what. In December, my mother began mentioning, almost in passing, that once you sell that place, obviously we'd hope you'd think about helping your sister with the rest of the furniture costs. My father asked me twice, with studied casualness, whether I'd gotten any calls yet about the property. A strange question for a house he'd described as barely worth the paper on the deed. Rachel posted a photo of her new apartment's skyline view with the caption, "Family really does look out for each other." And I noticed, because I notice everything, that 11 people from my extended family had liked it, including my father, within 4 minutes of posting. The confrontation came on a Sunday, unannounced, The way my father always preferred his ambushes. He showed up at my office instead of my house, which told me he wanted a professional witness to whatever he was about to say, even if the witness was only my own front desk. He sat across from my desk, not his, a detail I don't think he registered, and said, "Your mother and I have been talking. That house is going to sit there costing you in taxes and upkeep for a decrepit shack nobody wants. We think the responsible thing, the family thing, would be for you to just sign it over to us to sell, and we'll split whatever it brings 3 ways. You, Rachel, us. Nobody drowns in a bad investment alone." I asked him one question. "Dad, if it's worth so little, why does it need to be split 3 ways instead of just given to me outright, the way Grandma actually wrote it?" He didn't have an answer for that. He said something about family being about generosity, not paperwork, and left without shaking my hand. That afternoon I called my attorney, a colleague named Priya Anand, who specializes in trust litigation. The way you call a surgeon when you already know which bone is broken. I told her 3 words. Send the letters. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare one afternoon suddenly find all the time in the world once money entered the conversation, you already know exactly where this story is going. Stick with me, because the confrontation is the part nobody in my family saw coming, and I promise you, it was not loud. My mother scheduled what she called a small family gathering for the 2nd Saturday of January at my parents' house, ostensibly to celebrate Rachel's new apartment. I understood the gathering for what it actually was. An audience assembled to watch me get talked out of something I hadn't yet said I intended to keep. I accepted the invitation. I brought a folder. The house smelled like the roast my mother always made for occasions she wanted remembered fondly. Rachel wore a new coat. My Uncle Philip had driven in, which meant this had been discussed as a family matter well beyond my parents and my sister. My father stood at the head of the table and made a toast before dinner even began. To family, he said, and to knowing when to let go of things that don't serve us anymore. Everyone raised a glass. I raised mine too, and I watched Rachel's eyes flick toward me with something between pity and triumph, as though the toast had already settled the matter. After the plates were cleared, my mother turned to me with the gentle, patient voice she used on people she assumed were about to be reasonable. "So Mara, have you thought more about what we discussed? About the house?" I asked if I could say a few things, and my father, generous in his certainty that I was about to capitulate, gestured for me to go ahead. I opened the folder. I started with the small thing. "On November the 4th, I said, at dinner in this room, you told me the house was a mess, and that it might cost more to fix than it was worth. I have that conversation written down from that same night. I did not raise my voice. I want to talk about what it's actually worth." I laid the zoning notice on the table first, the public record showing the transit corridor's approved route, and the date it was approved, 8 months before Grandma died. Nobody spoke. I laid the second document beside it, the county assessor's comparable sales for the block, and the $401,000 figure for the 2 rear parcels alone, parcels that had been recorded under my grandmother's maiden name, and therefore never appeared in whatever cursory search my parents had run. "These lots," I said, "were never part of the house you called worthless. They back directly onto the new rail line. Grandma bought them in 1994 and 2001. She never told anyone but her attorney and, apparently, the city planning department." My mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. My father said too quickly, "That doesn't change anything, that's not what we..." I laid the third document down before he finished. It was Schedule C, with the paragraph highlighted where my grandmother had specified that the property was to pass to me, free and clear of any obligation to the estate's residual beneficiaries. Language Gerald had told me, when I finally called him with questions, was as close to bulletproof as trust drafting gets. Then I read one line from my grandmother's letter aloud, the only line I chose to share with the room. "Your mother will call it charity. It isn't. It's math." The room did what rooms like that always do. It went soft first, my mother reaching for my hand, saying we were overcomplicating a simple family gesture. Then it went emotional, Rachel, crying, asking why I would do this to her, as though my grandmother's zoning research 18 months ago had been engineered specifically to humiliate her new apartment. Then it went loud, my father standing, saying I'd always thought I was better than this family because of my degree, my job, my cold little folders. Then when none of that moved me, it went quiet, and quiet was worse because quiet meant they had run out of scripts. I answered each escalation the same way. One sentence, delivered no louder than the one before it. To my mother's soft hand on mine, I said, "You called this house a burden the same month you found out it wasn't one." To Rachel's tears, I said, "Nobody asked you to feel guilty. I'm asking everyone to stop asking me to feel obligated." To my father's volume, I said nothing at all. I simply waited, the way I wait in depositions, until the silence did the work language couldn't. It was my Uncle Philip, of all people, who broke first, not against me but against the room. He said quietly to my mother, "Diane, did you actually know about the back lots when you told her it was worth nothing?" My mother didn't answer him. That silence was its own confession, and everyone at that table heard it the same way I did. Philip didn't apologize to me, and he didn't defend me either. He just sat back down, and didn't say another word for the rest of the evening. I noted it. I didn't require more than that from him. I laid the last item on the table without a word. The small guest book from my grandmother's 90th birthday, 3 years before she died, opened to the page where my mother had written, in her own hand, "This house has always been the heart of the family. I hope it stays that way forever." I set it beside the zoning notice and let the two documents sit together, a decade of sentiment beside 8 months of silence. And I didn't explain the juxtaposition. It explained itself. Before I left, I stood, closed the folder, and said the only sentence I'd prepared in advance. "You told me I was getting a whole house and Rachel was getting an apartment, and that wasn't even close to even. You were right. It isn't." Then I went home. In the 4 months since, the practical matters have resolved the way documents, not feelings, tend to resolve things. Priya filed the trust and probate exactly as written. My parents' attorney reviewed Schedule C and advised them, in writing, that a challenge would not survive discovery, given the assessor's records and the dated zoning notice. My parents withdrew their objection 11 days later. The 2 rear lots were appraised at $401,000 in February. The house and its lot added $11,000, matching, almost to the dollar, the exact figure my parents had handed my sister for her deposit. A coincidence I've stopped believing in as random. I did not sell. I am having the house repaired instead, slowly, room by room, the way Theo used to say a piano gets tuned, with patience, not force. Rachel kept the apartment on Ferrer Street. We speak twice a year, at holidays, in the careful, surface-level way people speak when neither one is ready to name what happened and neither one has decided to try. My parents have not asked me for anything since January. My Uncle Philip sends a card at Christmas now, which he never did before, and once, last spring, he mailed me a photograph of my grandmother in front of the Larchmont house in 1994, the year she bought the first rear lot, with a sticky note that just said, "She always did play the long game." I keep it in the folder, behind the guest book. The guest book itself lives in my office now, on the shelf behind my desk, where clients occasionally ask about it, and I tell them only that it belonged to my grandmother. It no longer carries the weight of a birthday memory. It carries the weight of the exact moment my family's sentiment and my family's arithmetic finally sat next to each other in the same room and refused to agree. I don't think of any of this as revenge, and I'd ask you not to either. Revenge would have meant taking something from them. What I did was simply stop paying a debt I never actually owed. The debt of making myself smaller so someone else's shortfall could look, on paper, like generosity. With the first year's rental income from the 2 lots, once the transit authority finalized its easement agreement, I set up a small scholarship in Theo's name at the community college where he used to teach piano repair on Thursday nights. It isn't large. It isn't meant to be a statement. It's simply the kind of thing he would have done quietly, with his own hands, if he'd had the chance, and now I get to do it with his name on it instead of mine. My grandmother was right about houses. A house is never just wood and pipe. It's a decision someone made about who they trusted. And sometimes, the only way to honor that decision is to make sure nobody talks you out of it at the dinner table. If this reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts, and that boundaries are allowed even with blood, take that as your sign. Update what needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.